Henry II's reign was marked by ambition, power, and deep personal turmoil, a king whose quest to build an empire ultimately led to the unraveling of his legacy. His rule shaped the course of English history, laying the groundwork for both the legal foundations of the kingdom and the internal struggles that would later define the Plantagenet dynasty. From the moment he ascended the throne in 1154, Henry's vision of kingship was both grand and fragile, marked by triumphs and betrayals, glory and failure. As the first Plantagenet king, he would prove that even the most powerful rulers are not immune to the storms of family, faith, and fate. In the mid-12th century, England was a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse, torn apart by civil war and suffering the consequences of weak leadership and contested succession. When Henry II ascended the throne in 1154, he did not step into a stable inheritance or assume a peacefully bequeathed crown. Rather, his rise was marked by fierce dynastic struggle, fractured allegiances, and a landscape ravaged by 2 decades of near anarchy. His reign would prove to be one of the most transformative in English history, laying down the foundations of a legal and administrative system that would resonate for centuries. But to understand the weight of Henry's legacy, we must first understand the turbulent world that preceded his reign, an England bruised and battered by war, where centralized royal power had all but disintegrated. This period of chaos is often referred to simply as the Anarchy. A civil war fought between Henry's mother, Empress Matilda, and her cousin, King Stephen. The struggle began following the death of Henry I in 1135. Though Henry I had taken pains to secure the succession of his daughter Matilda, including demanding oaths of fealty from his barons, the idea of a woman ruling alone was still met with deep suspicion and resistance. Stephen of Blois, seizing the opportunity, rushed to England and claimed the throne with the support of many powerful nobles and the church. What followed was a bitter conflict, stretching over nearly 20 years, that decimated the kingdom both politically and economically. The war was not one of grand battles or sweeping campaigns, but of attritional sieges, private feuds, and relentless factionalism. Castles sprung up like weeds, becoming centers of power for rogue barons who often changed loyalties based on immediate gain. These were not just strategic outposts but symbols of the fragmentation of royal authority. Local lords acted with increasing impunity, issuing their own justice, raising their own armies, and bleeding the countryside dry. Chroniclers of the time, such as those contributing to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, painted a grim picture. Christ and his saints slept, one entry lamented, reflecting a deep sense of moral and social breakdown. It was within this crucible of conflict that Henry Plantagenet was forged. Born in 1133 at Le Mans in what is now France, Henry was the eldest son of Empress Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou. His lineage alone made him a figure of immense political significance. On his mother's side, he was the legitimate heir to the English throne, descended from the Norman line of William the Conqueror. On his father's, he inherited the powerful and wealthy county of Anjou, and eventually would add Normandy and Maine to his domains. These lands formed the core of what would become the Angevin Empire, a vast collection of territories stretching from the Scottish borders in the north to the Pyrenees in the south. Despite his noble birth, Henry's claim to power was anything but assured. During his youth, he witnessed firsthand the treacheries and betrayals that defined the Civil War. He participated in military campaigns from an early age, even traveling to England as a teenager to fight for his mother's cause. Though these early forays met with limited success, they proved vital in cultivating the warrior instincts, political acumen, and relentless energy that would come to define him. By the time he was in his early 20s, Henry had emerged as a figure capable not only of pressing a claim, but of actually ruling. Yet what set Henry apart was not simply his martial prowess or impressive heritage, but his vision of kingship. Where Stephen had allowed the realm to slip into disarray, Henry envisioned a centralized authority capable of commanding loyalty, dispensing justice, and reigning in the independence of overmighty nobles. He was driven by a sense of dynastic legitimacy. His mother had been denied her rightful crown, and he would not allow that fate to befall him. He was also crucially pragmatic. When the tides of war began to favor his cause in the early 1150s, he negotiated rather than annihilated his enemies. The Treaty of Winchester in 1153 marked the beginning of the end for Stephen's reign. It stipulated that Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but would recognize Henry as his heir. This compromise, revolutionary for its time, was a strategic masterstroke. It prevented further bloodshed and preserved a semblance of dignity for Stephen while paving the way for a peaceful succession. When Stephen died the following year, Henry was able to ascend the throne with relatively little resistance. But his coronation in December 1154 was not the conclusion of a struggle. It was the beginning of a monumental task: rebuilding a broken kingdom. The England that Henry inherited was not a unified or cohesive realm. Decades of civil strife had allowed baronial power to swell beyond precedent. Many castles had been built without royal license, and the king's writ held little sway outside the immediate vicinity of his court. The administrative apparatus established by earlier Norman kings had largely withered, and royal revenue had plummeted. Even the church, which had once served as a key ally of royal authority, had become increasingly independent and powerful in its own right. But Henry II was not content to rule over a loose confederation of noble territories. From the outset of his reign, he launched a vigorous campaign to restore royal power. One of his first acts was to demand the demolition of adulterine, unauthorized, castles, a move designed not just to eliminate physical strongholds of rebellion, but to send a clear message that the crown would no longer tolerate challenges to its authority. He reappointed capable and loyal administrators, revamped the exchequer, royal treasury, and revitalized the judicial circuits that carried the king's justice across the realm. It's also important to recognize that Henry's vision of kingship was deeply influenced by his continental upbringing. Unlike many of his Anglo-Norman predecessors, Henry spent much of his early life in France, navigating the complex web of feudal loyalties that tied the Plantagenet holdings together. He understood the importance of securing loyalty not through brute force alone, but through law, precedent, and carefully negotiated power. This continental sophistication helped him manage an empire that was far larger than any English king before him had controlled. At the same time, Henry's claim to the English throne was bolstered by the enduring legacy of the Normans. William the Conqueror's assertion in 1066 had fundamentally reshaped England, and his descendants maintained a powerful grip on the monarchy. But the memory of Norman conquest also carried with it an expectation that the king should be strong, commanding, and above all, a bringer of order. In this regard, Henry was the perfect embodiment of that legacy, but he also introduced something new. He wasn't merely a warlord or a usurper. He was a reformer, a builder of institutions, and a ruler who believed in the supremacy of the crown not only in battle but in justice and law. In many ways, Henry II's unique position at the intersection of Norman heritage and Angevin ambition made him a singular figure in European history. He was the first of the Plantagenet kings, a dynasty that would rule England for over 3 centuries, and one that would produce some of the most iconic and infamous figures in British history. But more importantly, he set a precedent for what it meant to be a medieval English monarch. He expanded the scope and power of the monarchy, not just through conquest or coercion, but by embedding it within the very fabric of English governance. As the founder of the Plantagenet line, Henry carried with him the hopes and traumas of a dynasty that had fought long and bitterly for the throne. He also bore the scars of a divided kingdom, one in which the lessons of civil war were still fresh and painful. His rule was not without its flaws. Indeed, many of the seeds of future conflict were planted during his reign, but it was a rule characterized by an unwavering commitment to restoring the dignity and strength of the English crown. The story of Henry II's rise is not merely the tale of a young man claiming a crown. It is the story of England's resurrection from chaos, the reassertion of centralized rule, and the birth of a dynasty that would shape the medieval world. Through his relentless energy, formidable intellect, and unyielding will, Henry turned a broken kingdom into the foundation of an empire, and in doing so, redefined what it meant to be a king. In the spring of 1133, in the ancient city of Le Mans, a boy was born who would alter the destiny of England and plant the seeds of a dynasty that would endure for over 3 centuries. This boy, named Henry, arrived into a world torn by conflict and ambition, but also one teeming with the potential for greatness. His bloodline, noble and turbulent, was an amalgamation of Norman tenacity, Angevin ambition, and imperial design. His very birth was emblematic of a world in flux, where old powers crumbled and new empires emerged. It was a world in need of a ruler with vision, vigor, and a willingness to command fate rather than be its subject, and Henry would be that ruler. Henry was the first son of Empress Matilda, daughter of King Henry I of England, and Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou. Through his mother, he inherited a legitimate, if contested, claim to the English throne. His maternal grandfather, Henry I, was the youngest son of William the Conqueror and had fought hard to consolidate his rule. With the tragic death of his only legitimate son in the White Ship disaster of 1120, Henry I named Matilda his heir. He compelled his barons to swear oaths of allegiance to her, a bold move in a society unaccustomed to female sovereigns. Yet upon his death, the throne was seized by Matilda's cousin, Stephen of Blois, sparking a bitter and protracted civil war known as the Anarchy. Geoffrey of Anjou, Henry's father, was no mere bystander in this tale of dynastic rivalry. A skilled warrior and political operator, Geoffrey held dominion over Anjou, a strategically vital region in western France. He was ambitious, aggressive, and cunning. The Plantagenet name derives from the sprig of broom, Plantagenista, he supposedly wore in his hat, a symbol of resilience and stubbornness that would come to define the lineage. Geoffrey's campaigns to secure Normandy, often while Matilda was engaged in England, laid the groundwork for what would become the Angevin Empire, a collection of territories spanning from Scotland to the Pyrenees, forged not by a central parliament or constitution, but by personal union, conquest, and dynastic marriage. Young Henry grew up in this climate of ambition and conflict. While much of his early life was spent in Normandy and Anjou, his imagination and destiny were tethered to the English crown. Matilda, a formidable and educated woman shaped by her time as Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, instilled in her son a powerful sense of entitlement and duty. She had fought for her rights and had nearly won the crown herself, being declared Lady of the English during a brief period of ascendancy. Though her reign was never secured, her legacy was imprinted deeply upon her son. He was her avenger, her heir, and the embodiment of her claim. Henry was precocious, intelligent, and brimming with energy from a young age. He was educated by a mix of tutors, clerics, and military men who ensured he was versed in Latin, history, and scripture, as well as the art of war and governance. He was particularly fond of historical and classical texts, which later helped shape his conception of kingship as a sacred and practical duty. But it was not merely learning that set him apart, it was action. By the age of 14, Henry had crossed the Channel to England to support his mother's cause. Though his first attempt to rally the barons to his side ended in failure, it marked the beginning of a lifelong pattern: persistence in the face of adversity. During his adolescent years, Henry gained valuable experience in both diplomacy and warfare. Geoffrey of Anjou, recognizing his son's promise, involved him in the complex management of Normandy and other territories. When Geoffrey died in 1151, Henry inherited the Duchy of Normandy. By the age of 18, he controlled more land in France than the French king himself, a reality that would complicate Anglo-French relations for generations. In 1152, he made a political masterstroke by marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and enigmatic women of the medieval world. Eleanor brought with her vast estates in southwestern France, as well as a sharp intellect and political savvy. Their union, though tempestuous, was a monumental moment in medieval politics, further expanding Henry's domain and prestige. With these lands under his belt, Henry prepared for the inevitable: a return to England to claim the throne. His campaigns during the final years of the anarchy were marked not just by military prowess, but by a strategic patience and calculation that belied his youth. He did not rush blindly into battle. He secured alliances, exploited weaknesses in Stephen's rule, and presented himself as a figure of stability in a kingdom weary of war. His forces were disciplined, loyal, and inspired by his charisma and reputation. Henry's charisma was not simply theatrical charm, it was the magnetic pull of someone born to rule. He was known for his tireless energy, often writing for hours on end, attending meetings late into the night, and involving himself in the minutiae of governance. His court, filled with a mix of seasoned warriors and intellectuals, was a reflection of his broad vision. He demanded loyalty but also respected competence, rewarding those who proved capable and dismissing those who did not. This created an environment where merit, at least to some extent, could rise above mere birthright, a rare phenomenon in a world dominated by lineage. What also distinguished Henry from his contemporaries was his sense of justice and order, even amid the chaos of war. While many noble factions during the anarchy were content to pillage and entrench their own power, Henry positioned himself as the restorer of royal authority and the protector of the realm. His military campaigns, while aggressive, were not merely about conquest, they were about reunification and relegitimization of the monarchy. His ability to blend force with foresight, conquest with conciliation made him a unique figure in the medieval landscape. In 1153, Henry landed in England once again, this time with the strength and support needed to challenge Stephen definitively. However, the final resolution did not come through bloodshed, but through negotiation. The Treaty of Winchester, signed later that year, recognized Henry as Stephen's heir. It was a moment of extraordinary maturity and wisdom for a young man still in his early 20s. Instead of insisting on total victory, Henry accepted compromise for the greater good of the realm. When Stephen died in 1154, Henry ascended to the throne not as a usurper or conqueror, but as a legitimate and broadly accepted monarch. Henry's early experiences in war, diplomacy, and governance prepared him well for the immense task ahead. He knew firsthand the dangers of disunity and the costs of weak kingship. He had seen what happened when baronial power went unchecked, when royal justice disappeared, and when the monarch became a figurehead rather than a force. Unlike his predecessors, he did not merely seek to hold the throne, he sought to transform it. This transformation began immediately. He set out to dismantle the private armies and unauthorized castles that had sprouted during the Civil War. He reasserted the primacy of the royal courts over feudal justice. He improved the exchequer, restructured local administration, and created one of the most sophisticated legal systems of the medieval world. These reforms were not merely administrative. They were philosophical, rooted in the belief that the king must be the source of justice, the protector of the weak, and the guardian of the realm's unity. Even in his early years as king, Henry displayed a remarkable understanding of how to balance coercion with cooperation, central authority with local autonomy, and tradition with innovation. He revived and expanded institutions created by earlier kings, while introducing new methods of governance that would endure for generations. His reign laid the groundwork for the common law system, and his efforts to standardize legal procedures would eventually shape the very concept of English justice. The seeds of this greatness were planted in the earliest years of his life, in the ambitions of his parents, the lessons of civil war, and the crucible of continental politics. Henry's story is not one of sudden greatness or effortless power. It is a story of steady ascent, of learning from failure, of cultivating loyalty through strength and vision. It is a story of a boy born into a divided world who, through force of will and brilliance, would build a new one. And so, as he rode through the muddy roads of England in 1154, now crowned as King Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet line, it was not simply the journey of a man returning home. It was the dawning of a dynasty, the rebirth of a kingdom, and the rise of a monarch who would change history. Their meeting changed the fate of Europe. When Henry, the energetic and ambitious Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, married Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152, it was not simply the union of two individuals. It was the fusion of two immense political powers, a seismic shift in the balance of the medieval world. Eleanor, having recently had her marriage to Louis VII of France annulled, was the most eligible woman in Christendom. She was not only intelligent and cultured, with a keen political instinct, but she also controlled one of the largest and most prosperous regions in France. Aquitaine, her inherited domain, stretched across a third of what is now modern France. By marrying her, Henry did not merely gain a wife, he gained dominion over an empire. The political implications were immediate and profound. Henry, already in possession of Normandy and Anjou through inheritance from his father Geoffrey, now had Aquitaine added to his titles. The reach of his authority expanded dramatically, uniting western France under his rule. This created a territorial mass so vast that it dwarfed the possessions of the French king, who was, in theory, Henry's overlord in France. In practice, the French crown had far less control over its realm than Henry would have over his. The union of Henry and Eleanor thus laid the foundation for what historians later termed the Angevin Empire, a loose but formidable aggregation of lands stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. But the marriage was more than a political calculation. Henry and Eleanor were both strong-willed, charismatic, and intelligent. Their partnership was dynamic and at times volatile, but also deeply rooted in mutual respect and ambition. Eleanor, more than most women of her era, refused to be relegated to the background. She had ruled as Queen of France, participated in the Second Crusade, and now stepped into her new role as Queen of England with clarity of purpose. She would go on to play a key role in English and continental politics, not merely as Henry's consort, but as a queen in her own right. Their marriage also signaled a cultural transformation. Eleanor brought with her the refinement of the southern courts of France. chivalric traditions, courtly love poetry, and a love of music and art. Her court became a center of cultural vibrancy, influencing the development of literature and thought in both France and England. Her sons, who would later rise to fame and infamy, grew up in this world of war, words, and political maneuvering, inheriting both the martial vigor of their father and the poetic temperament of their mother. From a territorial standpoint, the Union transformed the political map of Europe. The English crown, once confined primarily to the island and parts of Normandy, now claimed dominion over vast swaths of French territory. This complicated Henry's relationship with the French monarchy. Though he technically owed fealty to the French king for his continental holdings, his power eclipsed that of his nominal overlord. Tensions between the two crowns simmered and would boil over in later generations, but for now, Henry had achieved what few rulers could claim, a realm that spanned kingdoms and transcended traditional national boundaries. As their alliance solidified, Henry's focus shifted toward securing his inheritance in England. The kingdom had been mired in civil war for nearly 2 decades, an era historians call the Anarchy. The bitter struggle between Henry's mother, Empress Matilda, and King Stephen had fragmented royal authority and plunged the country into chaos. Castles had been built without license, laws enforced by personal whim, and the common people suffered deeply from the endless violence. By the early 1150s, the war had reached a stalemate, with neither side able to secure a decisive victory. Stephen still held the crown, but his reign was marred by instability and a weakening of central power. Henry recognized an opportunity. Unlike previous attempts to claim the throne through outright force, Henry approached the situation with a blend of military pressure and political negotiation. In 1153, he returned to England with a small but disciplined force. Though prepared for battle, he also came ready to make peace. His greatest advantage came not from a battlefield triumph, but from fate itself. The unexpected death of Stephen's only son and heir, Eustace. With Eustace gone, the path to compromise opened. The result was the Treaty of Winchester, a remarkable political achievement. Rather than risk further bloodshed, Stephen agreed to recognize Henry as his adopted heir, bypassing any remaining claimants. In return, Henry acknowledged Stephen's kingship for the remainder of his life. The treaty brought a fragile peace to the land, signaling an end to the anarchy and promising a renewed sense of stability. For the first time in a generation, there was a clear line of succession, and with it, hope for a stronger monarchy. The death of Stephen in October 1154 removed the final barrier between Henry and the throne. In December of that year, Henry and Eleanor were crowned King and Queen of England at Westminster Abbey. The coronation was not simply a ceremonial rite, it was a powerful symbol of restored legitimacy. The son of a woman once denied her rightful crown had now become the ruler of England by both blood and treaty. His coronation marked the beginning of a new era. Not just the rule of a king, but the dawn of the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry's ascent to the throne at the age of 21 was met with a mixture of relief and expectation. After nearly 2 decades of lawlessness, the English people were desperate for order. They wanted a monarch who could control the unruly barons, restore the royal courts, and reassert the authority of the crown. Henry wasted no time. Within months of his coronation, he began dismantling illegal castles, reclaiming royal lands, and reforming the exchequer. His reputation as a man of action, forged during his campaigns and negotiations, was now put to the test in the realm of governance. His legitimacy was further reinforced by the weight of his inheritance and the vigor of his rule. As King of England and Lord of more than half of France, Henry wielded an influence that few medieval monarchs could match. His court became a magnet for talent, clerics, scholars, soldiers, and administrators. He personally oversaw the functions of the kingdom, often traveling from shire to shire, holding court in castles and abbeys, and taking a direct role in the administration of justice. But the road to the throne had been more than a march of inheritance or conquest. It had been a masterclass in political survival. Henry had navigated a treacherous maze of alliances, betrayals, and conflicts. He had watched his mother fight for a crown she never wore, learned diplomacy from observing the fractious French court, and battled seasoned warriors in the civil strife of England. His marriage had been both a political and personal challenge, binding him to a woman of equal will and ambition. And now, with the crown upon his head, he knew the burden he carried was not just one of title, but of restoration. The alliance with Eleanor, the peace with Stephen, and the strength of his continental holdings gave Henry a rare and enviable position among European rulers. But they also placed him at the crossroads of conflict, between tradition and reform, baronial power and royal authority, England and France, loyalty and rebellion. It was a tightrope he would walk for the rest of his life. And yet, in those early years of his reign, there was a sense of possibility, of something new being born from the ashes of civil war and personal ambition. The court of Henry and Eleanor stood not only as a beacon of consolidated power, but as a place where law could flourish, where culture could thrive, and where the ideals of kingship were being reimagined. England had a king once more, and not just any king, a man forged in the crucible of anarchy, sharpened by experience and determined to shape a dynasty that would define a continent. When Henry II took the throne in 1154, he inherited not a kingdom, but a fractured realm teetering on the edge of chaos. The decades-long civil war known as the Anarchy, fought primarily between his mother Empress Matilda and King Stephen, had left England politically fragmented, economically weakened, and socially exhausted. Royal authority had eroded, and the mechanisms of centralized governance were in disarray. Barons had built castles without royal permission, local lords administered justice as they saw fit, and sheriffs, once loyal administrators of the king's peace, had grown corrupt, often functioning as petty tyrants within their own domains. It was a time when the law bowed to the sword, and the crown's voice barely carried beyond the reach of its court. Henry, still in his early 20s, faced an overwhelming task: to piece together the shattered remnants of royal power, to restore order to a land that had lived too long in lawlessness, and to establish the crown not as a negotiable authority, but as the unifying force of the realm. He approached this task not with hesitation, but with relentless energy. He traveled incessantly, held court in castles and cathedrals, summoned barons and bishops to councils, and personally oversaw the rebuilding of royal institutions. His style of rule was one of direct action, a hands-on kingship where he was as much a judge and administrator as he was a sovereign. The foundation of his reforms was justice. Henry believed that a strong legal system was the cornerstone of a stable and obedient realm. Under his rule, royal justice was no longer confined to the itinerant visits of judges or the limited authority of royal courts. It became a centralized, enforceable, and accessible institution. He revitalized and expanded the use of royal writs, formal orders issued by the crown that enabled subjects to bring cases before the king's courts. These writs, particularly the writ of right and writ of novel disseisin, allowed land disputes to be heard under royal jurisdiction, undercutting the baronial courts and reaffirming the king as the ultimate source of justice. This move not only curbed the power of local lords, but also endeared the monarchy to the common people and lesser landholders. For them, the royal courts represented a chance at impartiality, a reprieve from the arbitrary rulings of powerful neighbors or corrupt local officials. Henry's reforms led to the creation of a system in which royal justice could be sought across the country, laying the groundwork for what would eventually evolve into English common law. In his push for uniform justice, Henry dispatched royal justices on circuits throughout the kingdom. These justices, known as justices in eyre, would hear cases, enforce the king's law, and collect fines, strengthening both justice and royal finances. Beyond the law courts, Henry also turned his attention to financial reform. The treasury had been gutted by war, and the royal revenue was a shadow of what it had been under earlier Norman kings. Henry acted swiftly to restore the efficiency of the exchequer, the central institution responsible for managing the kingdom's income and expenditures. The use of pipe rolls, financial records, resumed regularity, providing a clear and detailed record of the crown's revenues. Sheriffs, who had previously pocketed large portions of local income, were brought under tighter scrutiny. Many were removed from office, replaced with men loyal to the crown and subject to annual audits. This not only restored some measure of honesty to the office, but also sent a clear signal. The king would no longer tolerate the misuse of public funds. Henry's financial reforms also extended to feudal dues and obligations. He revived and rigorously enforced traditional levies such as scutage, a payment made in lieu of military service, which allowed the crown to raise money while limiting its reliance on a potentially rebellious baronial army. He also ensured that revenues from vacant bishoprics and abbeys, previously siphoned off by corrupt officials or rival claimants, were directed to the crown. In doing so, he increased royal income and reasserted the crown's authority over the church's temporal holdings. Another pillar of Henry's restoration efforts was the reassertion of royal control over the nobility. During the anarchy, barons had taken advantage of the weak central authority to fortify their lands and establish near-autonomous rule in many regions. Castles had sprung up without royal approval, and many lords had maintained their own militias, laws, and courts. Henry recognized that if the monarchy were to survive, let alone thrive, this dangerous decentralization had to be undone. He initiated a systematic campaign to demolish unauthorized castles, those adulterine strongholds that had become symbols of baronial defiance. Hundreds were dismantled, and in their place, the king's own castles were garrisoned by loyal men and positioned strategically to assert control. He summoned barons to oaths of fealty, not merely as a ceremonial act, but as a legally binding commitment to obey the king's law and commands. Those who resisted faced confiscation of lands, imprisonment, or exile. The message was unmistakable. Power lay with the crown, not with feudal lords. Henry was equally determined to rein in the sheriffs, whose abuse of office had become notorious. These local officials were essential to the administration of justice, the collection of taxes, and the enforcement of royal commands. During Stephen's reign, they had operated with near-total autonomy, often enriching themselves at the expense of justice and order. Henry instituted a series of reforms to reclaim control. He required sheriffs to provide detailed accounts of their activities and expenditures, instituted procedures for regular review, and replaced those found guilty of corruption or incompetence. In some cases, sheriffs were chosen from among the king's clerks, educated men with no local ties and full loyalty to the crown. What emerged over the first decade of Henry's reign was a rebirth of royal authority, not just in title but in practice. For the first time in a generation, the machinery of governance began to function again. Royal officials carried the king's orders to every corner of the realm. Justice was increasingly dispensed according to a unified code rather than the whims of local lords, and the treasury, once empty, began to refill with regular and accountable revenue. Henry's reforms extended even to the church, though this would soon embroil him in one of the most dramatic conflicts of his reign. For the time being, however, his control over ecclesiastical appointments and revenues further solidified his supremacy within the kingdom. Bishops were increasingly chosen with royal input, their lands managed under royal oversight during vacancies, and their legal jurisdiction challenged when it came into conflict with royal courts. Though the church remained a powerful institution, its temporal authority no longer rivaled that of the crown without resistance. Underlying all these reforms was Henry's vision of kingship. He did not rule merely as a warlord or a figurehead. He saw himself as the embodiment of the law, the guarantor of order, and the central figure in a hierarchy of governance. He believed that the crown should not be dependent on the goodwill of nobles or the fickle fortunes of war. Instead, it should be rooted in institutions that outlast individual rulers, courts, finances, oaths, and laws. This vision was not without resistance. Some barons chafed under the renewed constraints on their autonomy. Clerics viewed the king's interference with suspicion. Even members of Henry's own family would, in time, rebel against his tight grip. But in these early years of his reign, the momentum was on Henry's side. The kingdom, exhausted from decades of strife, responded to his energy and decisiveness. Order returned to towns and shires. Markets resumed stability. Pilgrims once again walked safely across the countryside. The king, it seemed, had brought peace. Yet this peace came not from passive governance but from determined, often ruthless, control. Henry was not afraid to bend, break, or reshape traditions to suit his goals. He ruled with a lawyer's precision and a general's force. His reforms were not always popular, but they were effective. He had taken a realm on the brink and made it whole again, not through sheer force of arms alone, but through law, structure, and the careful reweaving of a tattered crown. The legacy of Henry's reconstruction of England would echo far beyond his own time. The systems he put in place became the scaffolding of English governance for centuries. His use of writs laid the foundation for the common law. His financial reforms strengthened the notion of accountable governance. His assertion of centralized authority redefined the relationship between the monarchy and its subjects. And all of it began with a kingdom in ruins and a king determined to rebuild, not merely to rule, but to create order where there had been none, justice where there had been lawlessness, and unity where there had been division. Henry II's reign was not confined to England alone. His dominions stretched across a vast expanse of territory that would come to be known by historians as the Angevin Empire. Though never called this by Henry or his contemporaries, the term reflects the sheer scale and ambition of the realm he controlled. a patchwork of lands that extended from the southern border of Scotland to the foothills of the Pyrenees, and from the Irish Sea to the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. At its zenith, the Angevin Empire encompassed not just England but also much of western France, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the duchies of Aquitaine, Poitou, and Gascony. Additionally, Henry held dominion over parts of Wales and Ireland, and maintained influence over Scotland through feudal obligations. It was, in geographical terms, one of the largest political entities in Western Europe during the 12th century. This astonishing territorial reach was not the result of military conquest alone. It was also the product of marriage alliances, inheritance, feudal claims, and diplomatic maneuvering. The core of Henry's continental holdings lay in his inheritance from his parents, Geoffrey of Anjou and Empress Matilda. Anjou, Maine, and Touraine came from his father, while his claim to Normandy and England stemmed from his mother, the daughter of Henry I of England. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152 expanded his influence dramatically, adding a vast and wealthy region to his dominion. Eleanor, recently divorced from King Louis VII of France, brought with her not only land but also significant political leverage, further solidifying Henry's position on the European stage. But this immense empire, for all its splendor, presented serious problems. It was not a unified state in the modern sense, but a loose and unstable collection of feudal territories. Each region had its own customs, laws, languages, and expectations of governance. The King of England was simultaneously the Duke of Normandy, the Count of Anjou, and the Duke of Aquitaine, each title demanding a distinct set of feudal obligations. In England, Henry ruled as a sovereign king, with centralized authority and legal reform. In France, he was technically a vassal to the French king, even though he controlled more French territory than his nominal overlord. The Angevin Empire was therefore a paradox, enormous in size, dazzling in its reach, but inherently fragile. Its strength lay in the personal rule of Henry himself. It was not bound together by institutions, bureaucracy, or common identity, but by the king's ability to travel, administer, and impose his will across distant and often fractious lands. Henry was indefatigable in his movement, traveling constantly between England and the continent, holding courts, enforcing justice, and managing disputes. His energy and attention to detail were legendary, and it was only through this ceaseless activity that the empire was held together. But even with such a vigorous king, the task of ruling such a domain was Herculean. Governance required delegation, and delegation meant trusting others, often family members or ambitious nobles, with considerable power. This trust was not always well placed. Henry's sons, brought up to rule, were given lands and titles before they were ready, creating competition, jealousy, and eventual rebellion. His wife Eleanor, once his most powerful ally, would become estranged and eventually take part in conspiracies against him. The very architecture of the Angevin Empire, based as it was on personal relationships and feudal bonds, was always vulnerable to disruption. Moreover, the political geography of the time worked against lasting unity. England and the French territories were not simply different in culture and law, they were often politically opposed. The French crown, though weakened by the fragmentation of power in its own lands, remained determined to reassert authority over regions like Normandy and Aquitaine. Henry's possession of so much French land posed a direct threat to the Capetian monarchy, and it became a central objective of French kings to exploit divisions within the Angevin territories to weaken and ultimately destroy them. The economic disparities between regions further complicated matters. England, with its efficient system of royal taxation and more centralized administration, provided a steady and dependable income. Its economy, based on agriculture and wool, allowed for reliable royal revenues. By contrast, the French possessions, though vast and rich, were harder to tax, more difficult to control, and more resistant to centralized authority. Aquitaine, in particular, was a cultural and political outlier. It had a tradition of aristocratic independence and regional pride that made it resistant to direct rule. Local lords often acted autonomously, and royal edicts from Henry were not always obeyed, or even acknowledged. Henry's approach to these challenges was pragmatic and often brilliant. He understood that a one-size-fits-all policy would not work. In England, he pursued legal and administrative reform, building institutions that could operate without his constant supervision. In Normandy and Anjou, he maintained traditional ducal privileges while asserting his prerogatives through careful appointment of loyal vassals. In Aquitaine, where resistance to central authority was most pronounced, He relied on diplomacy, marriage alliances, and strategic concessions to keep the peace. Still, these balancing acts were exhausting, and as Henry aged, the strain became more visible. A critical flaw in the Angevin system was the lack of a clear and stable succession plan. Henry, like many medieval monarchs, was both father and ruler, and he struggled to reconcile these roles. He granted his sons titles and lands during his lifetime, hoping to both prepare them for rule and secure loyalty. But this had the unintended consequence of empowering his sons to act independently, and even in opposition to him. The most notorious example came in 1173 to 1174, when Henry's sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey, joined a rebellion against him, supported by their mother Eleanor and various foreign allies, including the French king. The rebellion was ultimately crushed, but it exposed the inherent instability of Henry's vast dominion. The rebellion also highlighted a deeper truth. The Angevin Empire was not a true empire in the Roman or Byzantine sense. It lacked a unifying ideology, a centralized administration, or a common sense of identity among its people. It was rather a personal collection of territories tied to the fortunes and failures of one man. When Henry was strong, the empire held. When he faltered, it began to crack. After his death, it would fragment even more rapidly. In retrospect, the Angevin Empire appears as both a triumph and a tragedy. It was a dazzling achievement of political skill, marriage diplomacy, and military might. Henry had created a dominion that rivaled any in Europe, defied the power of the French crown, and brought a measure of stability to a war-ravaged England. But it was also a fragile and fleeting construct, never more than a generation away from collapse. Its weaknesses were embedded in its foundations. The over-reliance on personal rule, the absence of institutional cohesion, the political contradictions of a king who was both sovereign and vassal. What made Henry an extraordinary ruler? His restlessness, his capacity for work, his obsession with detail, was also what made the empire dependent on his presence. There was no system in place to carry forward his legacy without him. His sons would go on to become famous in their own right, Richard the Lionheart, John Lackland, but none would be able to preserve the unity Henry had forged. Within a generation of his death, most of the continental possessions were lost to the French crown. The dream of a trans-channel empire was over. And yet, the influence of the Angevin experiment would linger. It reshaped the politics of England and France, altered the balance of power in Europe, and laid the groundwork for centuries of conflict between the two kingdoms. It also exposed the limits of medieval kingship, showing that personal brilliance alone could not substitute for sustainable governance. The Angevin Empire, for all its promise, was as much a curse as a dream, a magnificent creation doomed by its own contradictions, and a testament to both the genius and the folly of Henry II. The relationship between Henry II and Thomas Becket is one of the most gripping and tragic tales of friendship, ambition, ideology, and power in English history. Their bond began with mutual admiration and complementary strengths, but ended in an act of violence that shocked Christendom and changed the landscape of church-state relations in Europe forever. This story does not merely recount a quarrel between a king and a cleric. It unravels a larger conflict between the power of the crown and the autonomy of the church. When Henry met Thomas Becket, the future archbishop was not yet a cleric of high station, but a talented, ambitious man with a keen intellect, a charming presence, and a love for luxury and power that mirrored Henry's own appetite for dominance. Becket, born to a merchant family in London, had risen through the ranks of the church and quickly established himself as someone of remarkable administrative skill. Recognizing this, Henry appointed him as his chancellor in 1155. This was a position of immense responsibility. Becket became the king's right-hand man, overseeing royal documents, legal matters, and financial affairs. Their friendship during this time blossomed not only from proximity, but from shared energy and vision. Becket supported Henry's agenda of restoring royal authority across England, especially in the face of a weakened post-anarchy administration. He conducted military campaigns, negotiated with nobles, and managed finances with a flair that made him almost a co-ruler in Henry's eyes. They dined together, joked freely, and shared a bond that went beyond protocol. Henry saw in Becket not just a capable administrator but a kindred spirit, one who could help enforce the king's vision across the realm. It was this closeness that led to Henry's fateful decision in 1162. When the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald, died, Henry nominated Becket to the position. It was a politically astute move on the surface. By installing his loyal chancellor as the head of the English Church, Henry expected to align ecclesiastical authority with royal policy. In an age when the Church wielded immense legal and social power, owning lands, collecting tithes, and even trying its own members in separate courts, this was a strategic effort to consolidate control. But Henry underestimated both the office and the man. Upon his elevation to archbishop, Becket underwent a dramatic transformation. He resigned his post as chancellor, adopted an austere lifestyle, and began to act less like the king's servant and more like the Church's champion. Whether this shift was driven by genuine religious conviction or calculated opposition, it marked the beginning of a rift that would consume them both. Becket embraced the spiritual duties of his new role with fervor and resisted Henry's attempts to subordinate the Church to royal authority. The most visible point of conflict came with the issue of legal jurisdiction, specifically, whether the Church or the Crown held authority over clerics accused of crimes. Henry's position was straightforward. All subjects of the realm, including criminous clerks, should be accountable to the king's courts. Becket, however, held that clergy must be tried in ecclesiastical courts, where punishments were spiritual rather than corporal. This disagreement went to the core of sovereignty. Was the king truly supreme within his realm, or did the Church hold a parallel, and often superior, jurisdiction? In 1164, Henry introduced the Constitutions of Clarendon, a set of legislative procedures meant to define the relationship between church and state. Among other provisions, it asserted the king's right to control the movement of clergy, to adjudicate disputes involving ecclesiastical figures, and to prevent appeals to the pope without royal consent. Becket initially agreed to the constitutions under pressure, but later repudiated them, claiming they violated canon law. The battle lines were drawn. The once close allies now stood as ideological enemies. The fallout was swift. Becket fled into exile in France in 1164, where he found support from the French King Louis VII and the Pope. During his 6-year exile, the quarrel between crown and mitre became a European diplomatic issue. Becket excommunicated royal allies and refused compromise. Henry, for his part, confiscated Becket's property and persecuted his relatives and supporters. The divide widened with every letter and edict. Negotiations dragged on for years, punctuated by tense moments of seeming reconciliation and abrupt breakdowns. Eventually, a fragile peace was reached in 1170, and Becket returned to England. But no sooner had he set foot on English soil than he resumed his confrontational stance. He excommunicated several bishops who had supported the coronation of Henry's son by someone other than the Archbishop of Canterbury, an act that directly challenged his authority. It was the final straw. When news of this defiance reached Henry, he exploded in fury. According to chroniclers, he uttered the infamous words, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Whether spoken in earnest or in frustration, the words were interpreted as a royal command. In December 1170, for knights, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard Le Breton, rode to Canterbury Cathedral. There, in the hallowed sanctuary, they confronted the archbishop. After a brief confrontation, they drew their swords and struck Becket down at the altar. The murder was as brutal as it was symbolic, the representative of the Church slain in the house of God by agents of the crown. Blood mingled with holiness, and a martyr was born. The shockwaves of Becket's death were immediate and seismic. Henry, though not directly implicated in ordering the killing, faced a tidal wave of condemnation. The Pope considered excommunicating him. Pilgrims flocked to Canterbury, where miracles were reported at Becket's tomb. Within 3 years, the slain archbishop was canonized a saint, and Canterbury became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Christendom. Becket's martyrdom became a rallying cry for church authority and a symbol of resistance to royal overreach. For Henry, the political cost was immense. He performed public penance in 1174, walking barefoot through Canterbury and submitting to scourging by the cathedral's monks. It was an act of humility rare for a medieval monarch, but necessary to salvage both his legitimacy and his soul. The crown had to retreat, if not in substance, then in image. Henry would go on to rule for many more years, but his relationship with the Church remained strained, and the memory of Becket's murder haunted his legacy. More broadly, the Becket affair altered the trajectory of English governance. It cemented the idea that the Church could not be wholly subordinate to royal will, that there were limits, even in an age of divine kingship, to secular power. Becket's defiance and death inspired not only ecclesiastical reformers, but also later political thinkers who saw in his stand the seeds of constitutional resistance. While Henry managed to hold on to his realm and even strengthened aspects of royal justice, he never again attempted to dominate the church as he had tried with Becket. The tragedy of Henry and Becket lies in what they might have achieved together. Their early partnership had held the promise of reform, order, and a more unified state. But that promise was undone by pride, conviction, and the irreconcilable demands of two institutions, the monarchy and the church, each laying claim to ultimate authority. Their story is not just about friendship turned sour, but about the inevitable collision between temporal and spiritual power in medieval Europe. One ruled the body politic, the other the soul, and when they clashed, the result was blood on the altar. The irony, of course, is that both men were, in their own way, right. Henry sought to unify and stabilize a fragmented kingdom, to bring order out of the chaos of civil war and weak baronial rule. Becket, for all his inflexibility, believed in the spiritual independence of the church, in its right to stand above the ambitions of kings. Their failure to find common ground led to a defining moment in English history, one that continues to resonate in the balance of power between church and state, conscience and law, authority and resistance. Henry II's reign was marked by sweeping reforms in governance and law, which reshaped the English legal system and established a framework that would endure for centuries. The king's efforts to restore order and centralize power after the chaos of the anarchy not only strengthened his monarchy, but also laid the groundwork for the modern English legal system. His legal reforms, notably the Assize of Clarendon and the establishment of the trial by jury, would have profound implications for the development of common law and the administration of justice in England. These changes not only improved the functioning of the realm, but also reflected Henry's broader ambition to assert royal control over both the church and the nobility. Before Henry II came to the throne in 1154, England had suffered from decades of instability and lawlessness. The period known as the Anarchy had left much of the kingdom in disarray. A lack of central authority meant that local lords and barons had more power than the crown, leading to widespread disorder and fragmentation. The absence of a cohesive legal framework left the English population vulnerable to the abuses of these powerful local figures, who often acted as judges and rulers in their own territories. This fractured legal system was further complicated by the influence of the Church, which controlled its own courts and legal processes, sometimes in direct conflict with secular law. This chaotic state of affairs necessitated sweeping legal reforms if Henry was to restore any sense of order and power to the crown. One of Henry's earliest and most important legal reforms was the Assize of Clarendon, issued in 1166. This was a set of royal ordinances that established procedures for law enforcement and the trial of criminal cases. The Assize of Clarendon aimed to create a more systematic and equitable method for handling criminal offenses, particularly those involving serious crimes such as murder, theft, and arson. Prior to this reform, the justice system had been largely decentralized, with local barons and sheriffs holding significant control over the administration of law. The Assize of Clarendon sought to reduce the power of local lords by centralizing control under the king's direct authority. The Assize established a formal system for investigating criminal cases. It mandated that every hundred, a division of land that was part of local administration, create a panel of 12 men to act as witnesses in criminal investigations. These men were responsible for presenting charges against those suspected of serious crimes. The Assize also introduced the concept of trial by jury, a revolutionary step in the development of English law. Under this system, a group of local men, often chosen from the community, would decide the guilt or innocence of the accused based on evidence and testimony presented in court. This marked a major departure from earlier systems, in which trials were often conducted by ordeal or combat, with little regard for evidence or due process. The introduction of trial by jury had a profound effect on the judicial process. It made the legal system more accessible to ordinary people and shifted the focus of justice from the arbitrary will of a local lord to a more democratic, community-based process. Juries became responsible for determining facts and delivering verdicts, and this allowed for a more impartial and consistent system of justice. Importantly, trial by jury helped to curb the influence of the nobility over legal matters, reducing the potential for corruption or bias in the administration of justice. Another critical reform introduced by Henry II was the establishment of royal circuits and itinerant justices. Prior to Henry's reign, the justice system was largely localized, with courts held by local lords and barons. These courts were often biased and inefficient, as the local lords had a vested interest in protecting their own power and wealth. In an effort to standardize legal procedures and ensure impartiality, Henry sent royal justices, high-ranking officials directly appointed by the crown, on regular tours throughout the country. These itinerant justices were tasked with hearing cases, conducting investigations, and ensuring that the king's law was enforced across England. The creation of royal circuits helped to reduce the influence of local lords over the legal process. By sending justices from the central government to hear cases, Henry ensured that justice was administered consistently, regardless of the local power dynamics. Itinerant justices were also responsible for overseeing the activities of sheriffs, who were responsible for maintaining law and order at the local level. This system of itinerant justices allowed Henry to extend royal authority into regions where local power structures were still strong, ensuring that the crown had a direct presence in every part of the kingdom. The royal circuits and itinerant justices played a key role in the development of common law. The term common law refers to law that is based on judicial decisions rather than legislative enactments. It is the foundation of the modern legal system in England and many other countries that follow the English legal tradition. Henry II's reforms were instrumental in the creation of common law, as they helped to establish a consistent system of legal precedent. When royal justices heard cases, they made decisions based on previous rulings, which helped to create a body of law that could be applied across the kingdom. Over time, this body of law became more sophisticated and formalized, forming the basis for the common law system that still exists in England today. In addition to these reforms, Henry also worked to centralize royal authority in other areas of governance. One of the king's key objectives was to ensure that royal officials, whether they were justices, sheriffs, or other administrators, acted in the king's interest and not in their own. To achieve this, Henry increased royal control over the appointment and oversight of local officials. He introduced measures to monitor the activities of sheriffs, who were responsible for maintaining law and order in their regions. Henry also introduced regular audits of royal finances to ensure that revenues were properly collected and spent. These reforms helped to strengthen the monarchy and reduce the power of local lords, further consolidating Henry's control over the kingdom. Henry II's reforms in law and governance were revolutionary in many respects. By centralizing legal authority, establishing royal circuits, and introducing the concept of trial by jury, he fundamentally altered the way justice was administered in England. These reforms not only helped to restore order in a kingdom still reeling from the anarchy, but also laid the foundations for a legal system that would evolve into the modern English common law system. Moreover, by reducing the power of local lords and barons, Henry strengthened the monarchy and solidified his own authority as king. While Henry's legal reforms were far-reaching, they were not without challenges. The centralization of power in the hands of the crown often met with resistance from the nobility, who were reluctant to cede control over their own domains. Some nobles saw the reforms as an infringement on their traditional rights and privileges, while others feared that the king's increased power would undermine their autonomy. Despite these challenges, Henry's reforms endured and helped to shape the future of English law. The legacy of Henry II's legal reforms can still be seen in the modern English legal system. The principles of trial by jury, royal oversight of legal proceedings, and the importance of legal precedent all have their roots in the changes introduced by Henry. His efforts to standardize and centralize the legal system were a crucial step in the development of the common law tradition, which continues to influence legal systems around the world. By establishing a more just, consistent, and centralized legal framework, Henry II helped to create a foundation for the rule of law that would endure long after his reign had ended. The reign of Henry II, though marked by his significant achievements in law, governance, and the consolidation of royal power, was not without internal strife. One of the most damaging episodes of his reign came in the form of the revolt of 1173 to 1174, when his own sons, fueled by a mixture of ambition, rivalry, and resentment, rose in rebellion against him. The revolt not only shattered the unity of the Angevin Empire, but also exposed the deep divisions within Henry's family, setting the stage for years of conflict and discord. At the heart of the revolt was Henry's eldest son, young Henry, also known as Henry the Young King, who had been crowned co-king of England in 1170, a rare honor bestowed upon a monarch's heir. The idea behind co-regency was to prepare young Henry for kingship while ensuring the continuity of royal power. However, the arrangement, instead of serving as a stepping stone to future greatness, sowed the seeds of rivalry and discontent. While Henry II had intended for the dual reign to strengthen his empire, young Henry's premature elevation to kingship created an illusion of power and entitlement that led to his dissatisfaction. His desire for independence, combined with his frustration at being overshadowed by his father, pushed him into open rebellion. Young Henry was not alone in his discontent. His brothers, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, also played central roles in the revolt, each driven by personal ambitions and grievances. Richard, who would later become Richard the Lionheart, had been promised the Duchy of Aquitaine, a vast and valuable region that had been part of his mother Eleanor's dowry. However, his aspirations were stymied by his father's refusal to give him control over the territory until he was older. This fueled Richard's sense of injustice and dissatisfaction, contributing to his involvement in the revolt. Geoffrey, who had been appointed Duke of Brittany by Henry, was similarly frustrated by his limited power and the lack of recognition of his abilities. John, the youngest of the sons, had been given the lordship of Ireland, but his role within the royal family was the least defined, leading to feelings of neglect and resentment. Each of these brothers had their own reasons for rebelling, but the common thread among them was a desire for more power and a sense of being undermined by their father's dominance. The rebellion was also heavily influenced by Eleanor of Aquitaine, Henry's wife, who had long been a key figure in his reign. Eleanor, once a queen in her own right and a formidable ruler in her own domains, was deeply displeased with Henry's increasing control over both her and their children. Her dissatisfaction reached a boiling point in 1173, when, after years of tension in their marriage, she became an active participant in the revolt. It was said that she encouraged her sons to rise against their father, perhaps seeing it as a way to reclaim her own autonomy and to restore a sense of power to her children. Eleanor's involvement was a significant turning point, as it brought an element of maternal loyalty into the mix, further complicating the conflict. The revolt of 1173 to 1174 was not a sudden or spontaneous event, but rather the culmination of years of simmering tensions within the royal family. The trigger for the rebellion was the political situation in England, particularly Henry's treatment of his sons and his refusal to grant them more power. The revolt began with a series of coordinated uprisings across the Angevin territories, led by young Henry and his brothers, who sought to wrest control from their father. The revolt was not limited to England. It also involved the support of several discontented nobles and foreign allies, including the French king, Louis VII, who had long been at odds with Henry. Eleanor's influence in the French court also played a crucial role in garnering support for the rebellion, as she used her connections to gain the backing of key figures who were eager to weaken Henry's rule. The rebellion quickly spread across the kingdom, with battles and skirmishes erupting in several regions. Young Henry and his brothers launched military campaigns in the north of England and in Normandy, hoping to capture strategic territories and weaken their father's control. However, Henry II was not a king to be easily overthrown. Despite the betrayal of his own flesh and blood, he responded swiftly and decisively, rallying his loyal supporters and launching a series of counterattacks. Henry's military expertise, honed over years of campaigning, proved invaluable as he methodically quashed the rebellion. His forces quickly retook much of the territory that had been seized by his sons and their supporters, and by 1174, the rebellion had largely fizzled out. One of the most significant events of the rebellion was the capture of Eleanor of Aquitaine. As the mother of the rebels and a key instigator of the revolt, Eleanor's arrest was a symbolic blow to the rebellious cause. Henry II had her imprisoned in various castles, effectively neutralizing her as a political force. Eleanor's capture also served as a powerful reminder of Henry's authority, as he was able to subdue both his sons and his wife with relative ease. The imprisonment of Eleanor, however, would have long-lasting effects on both her relationship with Henry and the future of their children. It marked a dramatic shift in the power dynamics within the royal family and laid the groundwork for continued discord and division in the years to come. Despite their military setbacks, the rebels, particularly young Henry and his brothers, managed to avoid complete defeat. Negotiations eventually led to a series of uneasy truces and peace settlements. Young Henry, who had initially been crowned as a co-king, was allowed to retain the title, though his role in the kingdom remained largely ceremonial. The terms of the peace, however, were far from satisfactory for either side. Henry II did not fully trust his sons, and the rebellion had irreparably damaged the father-son relationship. As for the sons, they had gained little in the way of concrete power, and their earlier ambitions had been thwarted. In the aftermath of the revolt, the divisions within the royal family did not heal quickly. While Henry II may have regained control, the damage had been done. The rebellion had exposed the deep fractures within the Angevin dynasty, and the personal rivalries between the sons would continue to shape the political landscape for the remainder of Henry's reign. Young Henry, though still nominally king, was increasingly marginalized, and his relationship with his father deteriorated further. Richard and Geoffrey, though initially reconciled, would later find themselves at odds with their father once again. Even John, despite his relatively minor role in the revolt, would become a central figure in the ongoing struggles for power within the royal family. The revolt of 1173 to 1174 also had significant repercussions for the kingdom as a whole. The rebellion left the Angevin Empire weakened, as the internal strife distracted from the kingdom's ability to respond effectively to external threats. The relationship between Henry II and his French counterparts, already strained, deteriorated further as a result of the rebellion. The revolt also set the stage for future conflicts, including the eventual rebellion of Richard and John against their father in the later years of Henry's reign. In conclusion, the revolt of 1173 to 1174 was a pivotal moment in Henry II's reign, one that revealed the complex dynamics within the royal family and the fragility of Henry's power. It was a rebellion driven by a mix of personal ambitions, familial rivalries, and political aspirations, and it ultimately exposed the deep tensions that lay beneath the surface of the Angevin Empire. Despite Henry's ultimate success in quashing the rebellion, the scars left by the revolt would persist, shaping the future of the English monarchy and the relationships within the royal family for years to come. The reign of Henry II, often considered one of the most significant in English history, was marked not only by internal reforms and struggles, but also by his foreign relations, which were crucial to the stability and expansion of his empire. His diplomacy with France, Scotland, and Ireland shaped the geopolitical landscape of the 12th century and ultimately contributed to the legacy of the Plantagenet dynasty. However, in his final years, Henry faced profound personal and political tragedies that led to his decline and death, underscoring the complexities and vulnerabilities of a ruler who had once seemed invincible. Henry II's foreign policy was deeply intertwined with his ambitions to consolidate power across a vast and disparate collection of territories, from England to France, Scotland, and Ireland. The success of his reign in these regions, while impressive, was often fragile, with shifting alliances, familial relationships, and territorial disputes posing constant challenges. One of the central themes of Henry's foreign diplomacy was his relationship with France. As King of England, Henry held significant French territories, including Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, which he inherited through his father and marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine. These lands were vital to his power, but they also made him a direct rival to the French king, Louis VII, and later his son, Philip II. Henry's relationship with Louis VII was complex, marked by both cooperation and conflict. Initially, the two monarchs had a relatively stable relationship, but it was strained by their competing interests in France. Henry's expansionist ambitions, particularly his control over the Duchy of Aquitaine and the Vexin region, brought him into direct conflict with the French king. Despite these tensions, Henry II's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, provided him with a significant advantage in his dealings with France. Eleanor's vast inheritance, which included Aquitaine, Poitou, and Gascony, cemented Henry's hold over a large portion of France, making him a powerful figure in European politics. The dynastic struggle between the Plantagenets and the Capetians, which involved a constant tug-of-war over territorial claims, was further complicated by the personal dynamics between the two royal houses. Louis VII's marriage to Eleanor, which ended in divorce, had set the stage for Henry's rise in France, and the relationship between Henry and Louis's son, Philip II, remained tense throughout their reigns. Philip II, who succeeded his father in 1180, sought to reclaim French territories lost to the English crown, particularly after Henry's successful campaigns in the earlier years of his reign. As a result, Philip and Henry found themselves in direct conflict, with Henry's empire in France becoming increasingly vulnerable to Philip's growing power. Henry's foreign diplomacy also extended to Scotland, where relations were often fraught with tension. Scotland was an important region in Henry's strategy for maintaining control over the northern borders of England. His relationship with Scotland was shaped by the complex interplay of power dynamics with the Scottish kings, especially Malcolm IV and William the Lion. In 1174, Henry II exploited the opportunity presented by William the Lion's capture during a campaign in the north of England. This event led to the Treaty of Falaise, which saw Scotland become a vassal state of England, with William agreeing to pay homage to Henry in exchange for his release. This victory was significant for Henry, as it reinforced his control over the northern border and solidified his dominance in the region. However, Henry's control over Scotland was not absolute, and the Scottish kings would eventually chafe under English suzerainty. The relationship between England and Scotland remained tense, with the Scottish nobility occasionally rebelling against English rule. Despite Henry's success in the short term, the legacy of English dominance in Scotland would be a source of future conflict, particularly during the reigns of his sons, Richard and John, when Scotland would eventually break free from English control. Ireland presented another significant challenge for Henry II's foreign policy. The English crown had long sought to assert influence over Ireland, but the island had remained a patchwork of independent kingdoms. In 1169, Henry intervened in Ireland under the pretext of helping the exiled Irish prince, Dermot MacMurrough, reclaim his throne. This intervention, which saw the arrival of English forces under the command of Richard de Clare, Strongbow, marked the beginning of English involvement in Ireland. Henry formally took control of Ireland in 1171, establishing a foothold for English rule in the region. However, Henry's attempts to establish direct control over Ireland were hindered by the fragmented nature of the Irish political landscape and the resistance of local rulers. The Irish would continue to resist English rule for centuries, and Henry's intervention in Ireland, while important in the short term, was the beginning of a long and turbulent relationship between England and Ireland. In addition to these territorial concerns, Henry's foreign relations were shaped by strategic marriage alliances that played a significant role in his diplomacy. Marriage was a vital tool in medieval politics, used to strengthen alliances, secure peace, and expand influence. Henry's own marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine in 1152 was perhaps the most significant of these alliances, giving him control over vast territories in France and providing him with significant political leverage. The marriages of his children also played a critical role in securing alliances and consolidating power. For example, Richard the Lionheart's marriage to Berengaria of Navarre was part of an effort to secure alliances with the powerful kingdoms of Spain and southern France. These alliances helped Henry maintain his position in Europe and provided him with support in his ongoing conflicts with France. Despite these successes in foreign diplomacy, Henry's final years were marked by personal and political tragedy. The death of his favorite son, Henry the Young King, in 1183, was a profound blow to Henry II. The young king had been crowned as co-king of England in 1170, but his relationship with his father had been strained. Despite this tension, the death of his son was a deeply personal loss, and it affected Henry profoundly. Henry the Young King had been a symbol of the future of the Angevin dynasty, and his untimely death left a gaping void in the royal family. The tragedy of his death was compounded by the ongoing conflicts within Henry's family, particularly with his surviving sons, Richard and John. Richard, who would eventually succeed Henry as king, had long been a source of tension between father and son. Richard had initially supported his father during the rebellion of 1173 to 1174, but later turned against him, aligning himself with Philip II of France in an attempt to secure his own power. Richard's relationship with his father deteriorated further in the years leading up to Henry's death. The rift between father and son was emblematic of the larger familial strife that plagued Henry's later years. The tension between them reached a boiling point when Richard, after inheriting control over Aquitaine and the vast territories in the south of France, began to actively undermine his father's authority. Philip II of France, who had been Henry's adversary for much of his reign, also played a key role in Henry's decline. In the latter years of Henry's reign, Philip and Richard forged an alliance that was intended to weaken Henry's grip on his territories in France. This alliance further exacerbated the political and familial divisions within the Angevin Empire. The fracturing of Henry's relationships with his sons, particularly Richard, represented the unraveling of the empire that he had worked so hard to build. The death of Geoffrey, Henry's third son, in 1186 further added to the sense of tragedy and decline that marked Henry's final years. Geoffrey's untimely death left yet another heirless territory, and it deepened the fractures within the royal family. Tensions with John, the youngest of Henry's sons, also simmered throughout this period. John's disloyalty to his father and his later betrayal were a major source of frustration for Henry, who had once hoped to use John as a pawn to maintain his power. Instead, John's ambition to claim the throne would eventually lead to even more conflict within the family. Henry's decline culminated in his death in 1189 at Chinon. His health had been failing for several years, and his final years were marked by bitterness and frustration over the fracturing of his family and his empire. Henry's death did little to resolve the conflicts that had plagued his reign. Instead, his sons would continue to fight for power, and the legacy of the Angevin Empire would be one of division and turmoil. Despite his many accomplishments, Henry's final years were overshadowed by personal loss, political betrayal, and the collapse of the empire he had sought to build. Henry II's foreign relations and diplomacy played a crucial role in shaping the political landscape of 12th-century Europe. His ability to navigate the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and territorial disputes with France, Scotland, and Ireland allowed him to expand and solidify his power across a vast empire. However, his later years were marred by familial strife, the loss of his favorite son, and the decline of his health, which ultimately led to his death in 1189. The tragic decline of Henry II serves as a reminder of the fragility of dynastic power, even for one of the most powerful rulers of medieval Europe. Henry II, the first Plantagenet king of England, left a lasting legacy that shaped the English monarchy, the legal system, and the future of the Plantagenet dynasty. His reign, which spanned from 1154 to 1189, was a period of immense political and legal transformation, as well as personal tragedy and familial conflict. His contributions to the development of English governance, law, and royal authority cannot be overstated. However, his legacy is also marked by the complexities of his reign, including his harsh treatment of his family, his conflicts with his sons, and his strained relationship with the Church. These contradictions have led to a mixed historical memory of Henry II as both a strong and effective ruler and a family tyrant. One of Henry II's most significant contributions to English history was his reform of the legal system. When he ascended to the throne in 1154, England was recovering from a period of instability known as the Anarchy, a civil war between Empress Matilda and King Stephen that had left the kingdom in a state of lawlessness and decentralization. Henry, determined to restore order and strengthen royal authority, implemented a series of legal reforms that would have a lasting impact on English law. One of the key reforms Henry introduced was the establishment of a more centralized and efficient system of royal justice. Prior to his reign, justice in England had been administered largely by local lords and barons, leading to a fragmented and often corrupt system. Henry sought to consolidate royal power by creating a network of itinerant justices who traveled throughout the kingdom to hear cases and enforce the law. This system, known as the royal circuits, ensured that royal justice was more uniform and less subject to local influence. Additionally, Henry's Assize of Clarendon 1166 introduced the concept of trial by jury, which became a cornerstone of English common law. The Assize of Clarendon also introduced significant reforms in the areas of criminal justice and law enforcement. It established a system of presentment, in which local communities were required to present suspects to the authorities, and set up a system for the prosecution of criminals through the use of local juries. This shift in the administration of justice represented a major step toward the development of a more standardized legal system in England, one that would serve as a model for future legal systems in the English-speaking world. In addition to his legal reforms, Henry II played a crucial role in the development of the English monarchy. His reign marked the beginning of the Plantagenet dynasty, which would rule England for several centuries. Under Henry's leadership, the monarchy became more powerful and centralized, with the king asserting greater control over the barons and nobles. The consolidation of royal power, however, came at a cost. Henry's insistence on controlling the territories of his vast empire, which stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, led to constant tensions with his sons and his vassals. These tensions would ultimately undermine the unity of his empire and contribute to the decline of the Plantagenet dynasty in the generations that followed. The complex nature of Henry's rule is reflected in his mixed legacy. On one hand, he was a strong and capable ruler who restored order to a kingdom that had been ravaged by civil war. His legal reforms laid the groundwork for the development of English common law, which would influence legal systems around the world. His centralization of royal authority helped to strengthen the monarchy and ensure that the king had greater control over his kingdom. On the other hand, Henry's treatment of his family, particularly his sons, tarnished his reputation. His relationships with his sons were fraught with conflict, and his attempts to assert control over them often bordered on tyranny. The revolt of his sons in 1173 to 1174, the eventual rebellion of Richard and John, and his harsh treatment of his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, all contributed to the perception of Henry as a family tyrant. Henry's relationship with his sons, particularly his succession issues, also shaped the legacy of the Plantagenet dynasty. While Henry sought to maintain control over his empire and ensure that his sons would inherit his vast territories, his attempts to divide his kingdom among them led to constant infighting and rivalry. His eldest son, Henry the Young King, was crowned as co-king of England in 1170, but his relationship with his father was strained, and he eventually rebelled against him. Richard, Henry's second son, would go on to become one of England's most famous monarchs, Richard the Lionheart, but his relationship with his father was also marked by rebellion and a desire for independence. Geoffrey, the third son, was another source of tension, while John, the youngest, would eventually become king, but his reign would be marked by failure and the loss of England's territories in France. Despite these family conflicts, Henry II's legacy as the founder of the Plantagenet dynasty cannot be denied. His sons, particularly Richard and John, played crucial roles in shaping the future of England, even though their reigns were marked by challenges and controversies. Richard's crusades and military exploits, as well as his eventual role in securing England's position in Europe, were influenced by the political and military structures that Henry had put in place. John's reign, though disastrous in many respects, would lead to the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, a document that would shape the future of English constitutional law and establish the principle that the king was subject to the law. While Henry's reign may have ended in personal tragedy, with the loss of his son Henry the Young King and the fracturing of his family, the Plantagenet dynasty he founded endured for several centuries. The dynasty would produce some of the most famous and controversial rulers in English history, including Richard the Lionheart, John, Edward I, and Henry V. The Plantagenet era would come to an end in 1485 with the defeat of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field, but the legacy of Henry II's reign would continue to shape English politics and governance long after his death. The legacy of Henry II is also intertwined with his portrayal in myth, memory, and representation. Over the centuries, Henry has been depicted in a variety of ways, from the idealized image of the powerful king to the tyrannical father. His complex relationships with his family, particularly his sons, have made him a figure of intrigue in literature and film. One of the most famous representations of Henry II in popular culture is in the play and film adaptation The Lion in Winter, which dramatizes the political and personal conflicts between Henry and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, as well as their sons. In this portrayal, Henry is depicted as a powerful and manipulative ruler, but also as a deeply flawed and tragic figure, torn between his desire for power and his love for his family. The canonization of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, further complicated Henry's image. Becket, once a close friend and ally of Henry, became a vocal opponent of the king's efforts to control the church. The conflict between Henry and Becket culminated in Becket's murder in 1170, an event that shocked the Christian world. While Henry did not order Becket's death, his actions and words in the lead-up to the murder were interpreted as a call for the archbishop's removal. Becket's martyrdom had a profound impact on Henry's reputation, both during his lifetime and in the centuries that followed. Becket's canonization in 1173 made him a saint in the eyes of the Church, and Henry's role in the events surrounding Becket's death has been a subject of intense scrutiny by historians. The tension between Henry and Becket has been depicted in countless works of art, literature, and film, further shaping the legacy of Henry II. In modern historiography, Henry II is often seen as a figure of both admiration and criticism. His legal reforms, military successes, and centralization of power are recognized as significant achievements, but his relationships with his family and his authoritarian tendencies have led to a more complex view of his reign. The portrayal of Henry as both a strong ruler and a tyrant is a reflection of the contradictions that defined his reign. In reassessing Henry II's legacy, historians have emphasized the dual nature of his rule. He was a king who built and strengthened the monarchy, but he was also a ruler whose personal relationships and political decisions created lasting divisions within his family and his empire. Henry II's legacy endures through the institutions he established, the dynasty he founded, and the portrayal of his reign in popular culture. His contributions to English law, his expansion of royal authority, and his influence on future monarchs have left a lasting mark on history. However, his personal flaws, particularly his treatment of his family, have colored his legacy, ensuring that his reign remains a subject of ongoing historical debate and cultural representation. Henry II, the first monarch of the Plantagenet dynasty, left a legacy that would deeply influence the course of English history for centuries. His reign, spanning from 1154 to 1189, laid the foundation for an empire that stretched across vast territories from England to the Pyrenees, but also sowed the seeds for political turmoil, civil unrest, and eventual revolution. While Henry was a figure of immense power and ambition, the complexities of his reign, marked by internal strife, legal reforms, and dynastic struggles, ultimately shaped the trajectory of both his dynasty and the English monarchy. One of the central elements of Henry's rule was his vision of kingship. As a monarch, Henry was determined to centralize power and strengthen the authority of the crown. The chaos and decentralization that marked the period of the anarchy left him with a kingdom in disarray, and Henry's reforms, particularly in law and governance, were aimed at consolidating royal control and establishing a stronger, more efficient system of justice. The Assize of Clarendon, the creation of itinerant justices, and the establishment of trial by jury all stand as lasting monuments to his ambition to regulate and unify the kingdom under royal authority. In doing so, Henry hoped to assert control over the powerful barons and lords who had long held sway over their territories, diminishing their ability to act independently of the crown. Yet, for all his efforts to create a more centralized and stable kingdom, Henry's reign was far from a smooth consolidation of power. The tension between royal authority and the feudal system that had long been entrenched in England continued to be a source of friction. Henry's efforts to exert control over his sons and the territories that would eventually become the Angevin Empire revealed the limitations of his vision. His sons' revolts, particularly the rebellion of 1173 to 1174, showcased the deep fissures within his family and his empire, and highlighted the difficulties in governing such a sprawling and diverse realm. These rebellions, combined with Henry's fractious relationship with the Church, set the stage for the eventual decline of the Angevin Empire and the political instability that would follow in the generations after his death. Henry's reign also indirectly paved the way for the Magna Carta, the pivotal document in English constitutional history. While the Magna Carta itself would not be signed until 1215, the events leading up to it were set in motion by Henry's centralization of power and his attempts to impose his will on the nobility. The grievances of the barons, particularly over issues of taxation and royal justice, were rooted in the broader context of Henry's reign. His attempts to increase royal authority and control over the feudal lords sowed the seeds of resistance that would later manifest in the demands for limitations on the king's power. The Magna Carta, which sought to curb the king's arbitrary authority and protect the rights of the nobility, was in many ways a reaction to Henry's legacy of centralized power and the abuses that came with it. The decline of the Angevin Empire also finds its roots in Henry's reign. The vast territories ruled by Henry, from England to Normandy and the Pyrenees, were difficult to govern and maintain. The fragmentation of the empire after his death, caused in part by the rivalry between his sons and their individual ambitions, marked the end of an era of Angevin supremacy. Henry's failure to secure a smooth and stable succession, along with his inability to reconcile the differing interests of his sons and vassals, contributed to the fragmentation of the empire. His heirs, particularly Richard and John, faced their own challenges in maintaining the empire, and by the early 13th century, much of the Angevin realm had been lost to France. This decline foreshadowed the eventual rise of the Hundred Years' War, a prolonged conflict between England and France over territorial disputes that would last from 1337 to 1453. The events that unfolded during Henry's reign, including the tensions with his sons, his fractious relationship with the French monarchy, and the weakening of English power in France, were all precursors to the later conflicts of the Hundred Years' War. In addition to these political and historical legacies, Henry II also left behind a mythos that would endure long after his death. As the first Plantagenet king, he is remembered both as a formidable ruler who sought to impose order on a fragmented kingdom and as a figure marked by personal tragedy and familial strife. His relationship with his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, his conflicts with his sons, and his role in the murder of Thomas Becket all contributed to his lasting image as a monarch whose personal flaws were as prominent as his political achievements. Over time, Henry became a symbol of both power and vulnerability, a ruler who built an empire only to see it unravel in his lifetime. This mythos has been perpetuated in literature, film, and popular culture, most famously in the portrayal of Henry and his family in the play The Lion in Winter, which depicts the struggles and tensions within the royal family during the latter years of Henry's reign. In this representation, Henry is shown as a king who is both ruthless and deeply human, torn between his love for his family and his desire for power. This portrayal reflects the contradictions at the heart of Henry's legacy. A man who sought to impose order on his realm but was undone by the very forces of familial loyalty, ambition, and betrayal that he sought to control. Ultimately, Henry's reign represents both the height of the Plantagenet dynasty's power and the beginning of its eventual decline. His efforts to strengthen royal authority and centralize governance laid the foundation for many of the political developments that would shape England in the centuries to come. Yet his failure to secure a stable succession, his strained relationships with his family, and his conflicts with the Church created the conditions for political instability and rebellion. In this sense, Henry II's reign can be seen as both a triumph and a tragedy, a period of great achievement in governance and law, but also one marked by the internal conflicts that would eventually lead to the breakdown of his empire. As we reflect on Henry's legacy, it is clear that his reign had a profound impact on the course of English history. The changes he made to the legal system and his centralization of royal authority were lasting contributions to the development of the English monarchy. However, his personal and dynastic struggles foreshadowed the political turmoil that would follow in the generations after his death. In the end, Henry II remains a figure whose mythos endures, a king whose ambition and flaws continue to captivate the imagination of historians, writers, and filmmakers alike. His legacy, marked by both achievement and tragedy, remains an indelible part of England's royal history, shaping the monarchy and the nation for centuries to come.